job tonight is one of the most pleasurable one that anyone could have, which is to welcome our friend, Sir Charles Mathias of Maryland. Perhaps you didn't know, or your response may indicate that you did, that by order of the Queen of England, he will this Thursday be presented the insignia of an honorary Knight Commander of the British Empire. That's as close as an American can come to being a knight in England, but he's there, and there have only been a handful of people. I'm not sure that anyone in Maryland ever has been a Knight Commander of the British Empire. Surely not many. Any knights here? We should, by some special act of Congress, or if Congress fails, by act of the state legislature, make him Sir Charles of Maryland. He is truly one of the greatest Marylanders in our history, and it's so hard to recognize that when a man is still living with us and going to speak to us tonight. But any judgment would be that he is one of the greatest of all Marylanders. One of the most remarkable evenings that I ever spent, and many of us here were there that night, was on July 14th, 1986, when Mac was honored on his retirement from the United States Senate. Those of us who were there will remember that the crowd of more than 1,500 people who came to the convention center that night, paying, I think, $250 apiece, to pay honor to Mac, including a majority of the United States Senate. And I think that maybe never before in history has a majority of the United States Senate met anywhere outside outside of Washington. The head of the Washington Diplomatic Corps, the ambassador from Sweden, was there. The British and French ambassadors were there, and each spoke. And there were a host of people from everywhere, and many spoke. Some may have thought too many, but there were 23 speakers that night, and the program was completed in 63 minutes. By strict orders, everybody was limited to 2 minutes, and everybody was checked in advance, and everybody agreed, and by gosh, almost everybody did it. It was another reason for a remarkable evening. But Mac is a man whose importance, whose true importance to this country will only be measured in history. Somehow it's difficult to get the perspective of what someone has been to our country while he's with us. Legends grow, but so does truth grow. And this is true of Mac. But on at least one occasion, his importance was underscored by an earlier ambassador from the United Kingdom, who prided himself on his study of of the history of the United States Senate and of the senators of the United States. And he made the assertion that it was his view that Mac Mathias was the greatest senator in the history of the United States. That was from a serious and profound historian of the United States Senate. The flyer that went out for this meeting gives some history of Mac and his relationship in foreign affairs. But did you know that? He was the first U.S. senator named chairman of the North Atlantic Assembly, consisting of the NATO representatives from the NATO nations, or that he is now chairman of the Council on the French Revolution, to commemorate the bicentennial of the French Revolution and its Declaration of the Rights of Man, a real milestone in the progress towards human rights. Matter of fact, Mac told me recently that it was only, I think, 30 days between the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Bill of Rights of the United States. and that these two great pronouncements by their countries on human rights were that close together. Or that for many years he has been a member of the Bilderberg meetings. Over the years, Mac has come back from the Netherlands and he's been to the Bilderberg meetings, which I guess I only remembered because of that strange name. But this was set up in the Netherlands to encourage exchange of ideas between European and U.S. people, business, politics, academics, and the professions. Or that he is now counsel of the American Council on Germany. Jack McCoy, who had been president for many years and retired at the age of 92, persuaded Mac to become president of the American Council, which is also an exchange program for prominent, important leaders in America and in Germany. Isn't this really quite a fellow? Aren't we really honored to have him with us, to be here as a friend, a Marylander, a distinguished countryman? If we had a glass, why, we would surely raise it in a toast to him, but all of us can hypothetically do so by saying to Mac Mathias, God bless you.
Well, I thank Jim Rouse for that extravagant introduction. Dr. Byrd, Mrs. Rouse. Jim was so generous that I hardly know how to respond, except to say that if it hadn't been for friends like Jim Rouse, I'd been practicing law up in Frederick all these years. Because no one can go it alone in any walk of life. You need lots of good friends, people who are willing to help, people who step up to bat at the critical moments in life, and I've been extremely fortunate in that respect. And whatever I have been able to do has really been the result of the kind of help that people have been willing to give me, the extraordinary support that I've had from personal friends and from people all across Maryland who express that kind of confidence and trust that makes it possible to do any public job. So I stand here not only grateful to Jim for what he has just said, but grateful to him and to all of you for the kind of support that I've had for so many years. Jim mentioned the American Committee on the French Revolution, which is trying to organize a program in the United States to commemorate the bicentennial of the French Revolution in 1789. And it's a formidable task because most of the people in the English-speaking world who think about the French Revolution think about Charles Dickens and The Tale of Two Cities. But it was an extraordinary event, and as Jim said, closely related to the expression of human rights in the United States. The two great countries, France and the United States, simultaneously made these guarantees of human rights in 1789, and we will celebrate jointly this extraordinary moment in history next year. And I dwell on this, Dr. Byrd, for just a minute because I'm looking for volunteers. We want to make sure that this moment in civil rights history and human rights history is recognized and remembered and properly commemorated, because that's the way we can guarantee that 200 years later we will still be having something to celebrate in that great field of human rights. Now, the prospectus for this evening talked about the relationship of foreign policy in the Senate and specified that I was to reflect on that subject. and I am happy to reflect on that subject, but I would propose to do it rather briefly and move along to the text for this evening that you yourselves may want to create through questions from the floor. But I do think it's important to think a little bit about the role of the Congress in the field of foreign policy, because there's a lot being written about it right now. Across my desk these days, I get memoranda that people are writing that they propose to send to the next president, whoever that may be. And one of the subjects that comes up most often in those memoranda for the next president is the subject of how to conduct foreign policy and how to relate the presidency to the Congress in the field of foreign policy. And I would suggest, if I were to write one of those memorandum, is to say, read the Constitution. Read the Constitution, because the words of the Constitution convey pretty clearly what the intent of the Constitutional Convention was in respect of foreign policy. For example, in Article 1, Section 8, there is a grant of power, the first mention of the power in the field of foreign policy and defense power, war power. Section 8 is a grant of power to the Congress, not to the President, but to the Congress. The power to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the law of nations. Well, that's sort of archaic language. We don't think much of piracy and offenses on the high seas, but you can translate that into modern terms. And I think if we looked into the minds of the members of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, we would find that they were thinking about what we today call acts of terrorism. And that when there is the necessity to deal with acts of terrorism, which unhappily there is today, we have to look to the Congress as the source of that power. Now, secondly, there is the ultimate power in foreign policy. And the ultimate power in foreign policy is the power to declare war. But it goes beyond that. It's not just the power to proclaim that a state of war exists, it's also the power to grant letters of marque and reprisal, and to make rules concerning captures on land and water. Now, if that means anything at all, and these again are archaic words, not much considered by many people these days, but they're there, they're part of the Constitution, and if they mean anything at all, it seems to me they mean that the Constitutional Convention wanted the Congress not only to have jurisdiction over the subject of general war and the existence of a state of war, but also over questions of limited war. And you hear it debated sometimes in connection, for instance, with the Lebanon operation. Well, Congress is not equipped, is not empowered to deal with limited war, but here it is, in the words of the Constitution. I think that the Convention contemplated hostilities at a lower level than a general state of war, and therefore they provided for granting letters of marque, which of course was authorizing a kind of a low-level private warfare by people commissioned to carry it on. It was the Congress which has the power to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money for that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. The founders provided that the Congress should provide and maintain a navy. It doesn't just say build some ships and hire some sailors. It said provide and maintain a navy, which implies a continuing oversight and relationship. And finally, the Constitution provides that the Congress shall make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. So that contemplates more than passing a bill to authorize recruitment of troops. It was envisioned as having a continuing relationship with the government and the regulation of the land and naval forces. Now, the next section of Article 1 of the Constitution provides a role for the Congress not only in foreign policy, but in fact in everything the government does, because that's where it provides that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. And since everything the government does, or virtually everything, costs money in some degree, congressional approval of appropriations is an invitation to make policy determination on whether the appropriation is justified, and whether it's wise, and whether it's prudent, and whether it's in the best interest of the United States. Now, in Article 2, the Constitution makes further provisions that affect the power over foreign policy, the power to make war. Because Article 2, Section 2 provides that the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. Now, how do you reconcile that with the preceding provision that authorizes the Congress to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces? Article 2 further provides that the President shall have the power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties. And it seems to me that if you consider all of this language together, the pattern that the Founding Fathers had in mind is very clear. They were thinking about a coordinated policy, not a policy in which the President dictates the foreign policy, or in which the Congress legislates it, but in which the President and the Congress have to get together and coordinate their foreign policy and defense decisions. That the President shall have the power by and with the advice of the Senate to make treaties means that the President does go out and make the treaties. He can send the ambassadors to do the negotiating, but he can't make the treaty operative alone. He has to have the concurrence of the Senate. So the Senate is guaranteed a consultative and a dispositive position with respect to any treaties, with the additional provision that 2/3 of the Senate must concur. 2/3 of those present must concur. The Constitution then provides one of the most extraordinary provisions in any Constitution anywhere in the world. One that I find people from every other country with whom I have talked are somewhat amazed that it's in our Constitution, amazed that it's worked for 200 years, because it results in the dilution of the appointive power of the executive. When the Prime Minister of England is appointing some official in that country, there isn't any question about it. In most countries, there's no question when the executive makes an appointment. But our Constitution provides that by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, the President shall appoint ambassadors and other public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States. And the impact of that provision alone on foreign policy is incalculable. If the President can appoint ambassadors only after consulting the Senate and only with the concurrence of the Senate, the whole question of the policies that those ambassadors execute becomes a matter of some discussion. And by making the same provision with respect to all other officers of the United States, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense are included within that perimeter of the Senate's jurisdiction to advise and consent. And I have had the experience of sitting in confirmation hearings for Secretaries of State and for other State Department officials, and hearing the question of policy raised again and again and again. It's not just, are you an honest man, are you a sane man or woman, but what kind of policy are you going to offer to this country? Tell us what you feel about the issues of the day. And if the Senate doesn't like the answers it gets to those questions, that confirmation is then in doubt. So the confirmation power is not simply a personnel policy. It becomes, in fact, a very important policy question. The influence on policy as a result is very apparent to anyone who follows confirmation proceedings. There was a book written some years ago called The President, The Office and the Powers by Professor Edward S. Corwin. Dr. Byrd may have used that book over the years. Dr. Corwin said that what the Constitution does, and all that it does, is to confer on the President certain powers capable of affecting our foreign relations, and certain other powers of the same general kind on the Senate, and still other such powers on the Congress. But which of these organs shall have the decisive and final voice in determining the course of the American nation is left for events to resolve. Well, I don't think it's quite that vague. I'm a little more positive than Professor Corwin in that respect, because I think the Constitution mandates a coordinated policy in every conceivable situation. The President surely has to give the command for armies to march. The President must give the command for ships to sail, by implication for airplanes to fly, for missiles to launch. But the policy that justifies the command clearly has to involve the Congress. And only the Congress can declare war. And about that, there's simply no ambiguity at all. On the question of limited war, on the question of terrorism, piracy, felonies on the high seas, I think it's equally clear that those subjects are within the ambit of congressional authority. In the various experiences through which we passed, without exception, the Congress has had a proper interest beyond the mere power of the purse or the control of appropriations. I'd like just to say one further word on this subject before we go to your questions, because one of the practical methods for coordinating the legislative and executive functions in foreign policy was the enactment of the War Powers Act. My great friend of many years, Senator Jacob Javits of New York, was the primary author of the War Powers Act. It's been a controversial act. It was very controversial when it was being debated in the Congress. In fact, although the Congress passed it, President Nixon vetoed it, and it was finally enacted into law over the President's veto. So it had a stormy birth, and it has had a stormy life ever since, because even to this day, as a part of this presidential campaign in which we're now engaged, there is a debate about the invoking of the War Powers Act. Should it have been invoked in the Persian Gulf, for example? Is it constitutional? Is it in the best interest of the United States in the development and execution of our foreign policy? The Reagan administration, including the President, Secretary of State, and the former Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, have all stated that, in their opinion, the War Powers Act is unconstitutional. They have resisted its invocation by raising serious political opposition to it. Now, given the extent of the powers delegated to the Congress to define policy in that spectrum of situations that we have discussed, it's hard for me to take the claims of unconstitutionality as very serious. I have to admit that you can argue that the War Powers Act is unsound. You can say that it's unworkable. There are those who say that it's ineffective. I disagree with those arguments, but they're not irrational. Now, one of the arguments made against the act is that it authorizes the President to act recklessly because it gives him that initial period in which he can act without further congressional authority. And I would reject that as an argument because it's clear that any president has to be expected to repel, for example, an attack on the soil of the United States, or to repel an attack on any serious United States interest, wherever it's located. An attack on this country has to be repelled immediately. And to argue that a president lacks such discretion, I think, is to misread the whole purpose of the constitutional provisions for defense. There are some who have questioned the value of the War Powers Act, have thought it's ineffective, but I would point to the experience in Lebanon as one of the examples that proves its usefulness. Some of you may remember that at the beginning of the Lebanon operation, there was a big discussion as to whether the War Powers Act should be invoked, how long a waiting period the president should have before getting a resolution of concurrence from the Congress, and there was some compromise in that respect. But in fact, American forces withdrew within the time period that was contemplated by the original language of the War Powers Act. But the important thing in the Lebanon experience was that the War Powers Act was an inhibition against escalation. One of the features of the War Powers Act is that the president can't pour troops in, as happened in Vietnam, without the concurrence of the Congress. And there were periods during the Lebanese episode when the administration was very, very strongly tempted to increase the number of forces and the size of the commitment in Lebanon. But the fact that escalation was inhibited and restrained by the War Powers Act helped, in my opinion, to keep that tragedy from being larger than it was. So I think the War Powers Act is a proper exercise of legislative power, that it's constitutional, and that it ought to be invoked on appropriate occasions. Now, the administration still objects to the War Powers Act. There are those in the administration who call congressional interest interference, but even during the Persian Gulf situation, it conceded the right of the Congress to interfere by accepting the obligation to report to the Congress on the state of the activities in the Gulf by independent legislation. But by doing that, I think the president recognized the right of Congress to be officially informed. And of course, once the Congress is informed, once it's seized of the facts, it has the opportunity and the duty to react. So I think by implication, even the Reagan administration has accepted that point of view. So we come back to the old question of who is in charge of foreign policy. One of the classic questions that relates to American government. Who is in charge of foreign policy? And I would have to suggest that the realistic answer, the only realistic answer, is that we all are in charge of foreign policy. There is a presidential role, a very clear presidential role. There is a congressional role. And in a democracy, that means that the people have their role. It's a system that's not without difficulty. The system, moreover, is not without danger, because where no single person is in total charge, it's possible to usurp authority, and it's equally possible to evade authority. In such a system, a high degree of coordination is required and a high degree of respect for the rights and opinions of others. I have to say with some sadness that I have observed recently that there's been a lack of both. I can recall in the last 25 or 30 years secretaries of state who took extraordinary care to attain understanding, who came down to Capitol Hill again and again to explain administration policies, and who sat through what must have been very painful sessions hearing congressional views on those policies. But great as their efforts were, I would conclude that they were not too great for the need, because the need for this kind of mutual understanding is extraordinary. Democracy makes many demands on Democrats, one of the greatest of these demands in our republic is the successful sharing of the power to conduct foreign affairs.
Would you comment on the method through which we select our president?
Well, there seem to be a great many Americans who are unhappy with the way we've selected the candidates in 1988. Of course, the method we've used is the empiric method. It's the method we've developed out of our national experience for the last 200 years. And it's changed a little bit as the country's changed, as the kind of American society that has developed has changed. But I do have some suggestions as to some changes, not very difficult changes. I would give credit to my friend Howard Baker for some of these ideas because he has been advocating them for some time. But I think one of the problems that we're into in this country in choosing a president is the extraordinary length of time in which we have these candidates running around the country. Now, Howard Baker's suggestion on how we shorten that up is very simple. You just have it doesn't even require an act of Congress. You just have the Federal Election Commission say that they're not going to recognize for matching funds any expenditures made before January of the election year. And that takes about 2 years off the campaign. Then you get a kind of an echo effect out of the primary system the way it's presently operating. I don't believe that there are too many Americans who would want to give up the kind of democratic approach to choosing the candidate that's involved in the primary, but we have this strange operation of the system in this country whereby one or two obscure primary results take on an extraordinary resonance in the rest of the campaign. And Howard's suggestion to avoid that is that the two parties, this doesn't even require an official act, just an act of the political parties themselves, that the two parties say that they will only seat delegates in the National Convention who are elected in a single month, say the month of May or the month of June. It's not important which month, but just so that you compress the primaries into a 30-day period. And then there is a third suggestion, which I would not have perhaps advanced in an earlier stage in my career because it might have sounded self-serving, but I'm free to do it tonight. And that is to say that incumbent governors and incumbent United States senators representing the states should automatically be members of the party conventions. They should automatically be delegates so that you have some blending of the political leadership of the country with the leadership of the parties and get some benefit of experience into the process. Now, those simple suggestions might not cure the difficulties in the process that we have today, but I think they're practical and they would improve it.
Would you comment on the current administration, the Iran-Contra affair, and the Constitution?
Well, I'm not going to comment on Oliver North because he is before the courts and under the law is presumed to be innocent, and we'll leave him in that posture until the courts make their decision. But I think there were clear violations of law and certainly of the spirit of the Constitution, that spirit that I talked about tonight, requiring coordination, by failure to consult with the Congress on what was clearly a major foreign policy decision, one that involved the vital interests of the United States. And I don't think that there's really much dispute about that because both President Reagan and Vice President Bush have admitted that there have been faults.
Would you comment upon, or could you give your opinion, and would you give your opinion about the level of sophistication of your colleagues in the Senate in the area of foreign affairs?
Well, I hear some laughing, but actually I wish that I could parade the 100, the other 99 in front of you tonight, because I think you'd be impressed, really. There is a high degree of knowledge about the world collectively in the Congress. That doesn't mean that everybody in the Congress knows everything there is to know about foreign policy. I'm not claiming that. But you've got some people who know a great deal. I think, for example, of my old friend and colleague Mike Mansfield. What an extraordinary human being Mike Mansfield is. As you know, he is now the longest-serving ambassador of the United States anywhere in the world. He's been ambassador to Japan since he was appointed to that position by President Carter almost 12 years ago, over 10 years ago. But Mike Mansfield didn't learn all he knows about the Far East since he's been ambassador to Japan. He was a real expert on the Orient. He had served in the United States Marines in the Orient back in the days when I think that was called the China Station. And he had become an expert in the Orient, knew a lot about it, and he imparted that knowledge, not in any pedagogical way, but he was there as a source of information and guidance on foreign policy questions. You had people like John Sherman Cooper from Kentucky, extraordinary interest in foreign policy. He himself, at various times in his career, served as ambassador to India and ambassador to East Germany. But he had a profound interest in foreign policy. Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania had served in China in World War II and was an expert on Chinese affairs, and incidentally an expert on Chinese art, which was one of the kind of facets through which he learned a lot about Chinese culture and Chinese life. A great many members of the Senate, I think of Scoop Jackson as one, Senator Leverett Saltonstall as another. I'm just sort of picking names out of the roster who knew a great deal about European affairs, about what went on in Europe with our European allies. So without trying to claim that everybody in the Senate is an expert on any of foreign affairs or that everybody knows a lot about some of it, there really are some remarkably well-informed people, and it's like any other group. You know, the Congress is a very representative group, not only representative by law, but just by fact. They're like the rest of the American people. When you get a group of people together and you have some people who are experts or recognized as knowing more than others by the group, you learn from each other. And the fact that these people exist really leavens the loaf, and I don't think you would be disappointed at the level of knowledge and experience about foreign affairs in the Congress.
I think the question was, is there any relief from the dreariness of Republicans? We don't endorse every question which is raised, but we do repeat them, certainly.
I think Dr. Byrd could have called that question out of order because it's not on the subject of foreign policy. But you say the Democrats are a squabbling lot. I'm not sure that you should have excluded the Republicans from that definition. I recall one of the latter years of my service in Congress being addressed as a liberal swine by one of my fellow Republicans. So that's a fairly high level of squabbling. Seriously, I think these things are cyclical in American history. We all remember Nelson Rockefeller, the great progressive or moderate leader of the Republican Party in his generation, but not many people recall that Nelson Rockefeller's full name was Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, and his grandfather, Nelson Aldrich, was one of the most reactionary, conservative Republican senators anywhere in the country, and came from the East Coast, and at that time the center of Republican liberalism, and it was not moderation, it was real liberalism, was in the Midwest. And there was that gradual change where the Midwest became the center of conservatism and the East Coast Republicans were the more liberal ones. So this thing isn't immutable. There is constant change going on, and I think that there will be some cyclical change again. The tide may not come in fast enough to lift me up, but I think it'll come.
I think the question is whether the lack of time devoted to the discussion of the tax bill in effect disfranchises voters, and there's a slight link to foreign affairs suggested in the question.
Well, I'm going to grab hold of that slight link to foreign affairs. Let me say that there are several important bills pending in the Congress as we talk here this evening. There is the drug bill, which, whatever merits it has some very serious problems involved in it. And there is the the so-called technical adjustments to the Tax Act, which will have profound impact for a lot of individuals, which is being debated and presumably will be decided between now and the end of the week, early next week at the very latest. And these are, of course, less than desirable methods of legislating. It would be better if these things could be brought up at the very beginning of a session so that the country could engage in the discussion and the debate. Having said that, you have to get these bills up when you can, and the only recourse of the citizen is to take a look at them once the ink is dry, and that will happen at least several weeks before the 8th of November, I'm convinced, and you can make your final judgment on the 8th of November. But you did bring up a foreign policy question that I'd like to just say one quick word on. One of the problems for either George Bush or for Michael Dukakis, whoever ends up in the White House, is going to be having the ability to do very much in the foreign policy field or in the domestic policy field. When Ronald Reagan entered the White House in January of 1981, he had available 79 cents out of each tax dollar to be devoted to purposes of national defense and domestic programs. 79 cents. To show you what has happened in the last 8 years that is drastically reducing the power of the president, the discretion of the president in planning for national policy. The new president, be it Bush or Dukakis, will only have 63 cents out of the tax dollar available for both defense purposes and domestic programs. An extraordinary shrinkage in the options that are normally exercised by a new administration coming in. So it is a serious outlook for either candidate, and one that I think will have an impact on the way we conduct foreign policy. And very little noticed, very little mentioned in the course of this campaign. In fact, I don't think I've seen it brought up except in a few rather erudite columns in the newspapers, but certainly not by any candidate.
Would you care to comment upon the issue of the ACLU as it has been raised in this campaign?
I had the good fortune to have known Roger Baldwin, who was the founder of the ACLU and one of the most remarkable Americans and one of the most genuine Americans that I have ever known. He just was the very image of a vigorous, intelligent, inquisitive, alert American. It's almost inadequate to say he's an American as apple pie because his family developed the Baldwin apple, so. But I think that the organization that he founded, the ACLU, has had an immeasurable effect on American life, a valuable, positive effect. Just not to take too much time on it, but it's worth just a minute to think of the impact that the ACLU has had on our society. The Scopes trial. Clarence Darrow, who was the defense lawyer in the Scopes trial, the famous trial on the issue of creationism and evolution. Clarence Darrow was a member of the ACLU and participated at the request of the ACLU in that trial. And it has had a real impact in American life. Let me tell you, this issue of creationism and evolution isn't dead yet. I'll tell you a story with a foreign policy angle to it. I was one day sitting in the Committee on Foreign Relations, and we were examining the nominee to be the ambassador to Ecuador. And the proceedings were a little dull, and I thought I would liven them up with a facetious question. And you know, the Galapagos Islands, where Darwin thought out his theory of evolution, are in Ecuador, or off the coast of Ecuador, within the jurisdiction. So I lightly said to the ambassador designate, "Are you a creationist or an evolutionist?" And the blood just drained from his face. He absolutely froze. And I was shocked by his reaction until I suddenly realized what I had done, because there sitting beside me on the bench was Jesse Helms. So, although the debate over creationism and evolution isn't totally dead in this country, it was the Scope trial that really set the tone for modern American society on that kind of question of prejudice. The serious questions that were involved there are freedom of speech and freedom of religion. The internment of Japanese Americans in California in World War II was another case in which the ACLU was involved at the time, not in retrospect, not going back to pay the Japanese Americans some compensation, but at the time they were going into court unsuccessfully, as it turned out, but very courageously trying to get justice for them at the time. I paid a visit several years ago, shortly before his death, on Chief Justice Earl Warren. And in the course of our conversation, Chief Justice Warren said that he felt that his participation as Attorney General of California in the internment of the Japanese Americans was the greatest single mistake of his life. And that was a mistake the ACLU didn't make. Well, we could go on with a number of other examples, but it doesn't mean they're always right. I don't know anybody or any organization that is always right. And they certainly, in pursuit of defense of constitutional principles, pick up some very unsavory clients. But that doesn't mean the cases aren't right. And I think that they have made a profound contribution to American society.
Mr. Benzon.
Would you comment about current changes in power relationships in the Soviet Union, within the Soviet bloc, and on the upheavals which seem to be resulting?
Well, that is a fascinating question. and one that if we were really to deal adequately with it, we'd give up listening to the debate tonight. But let me very briefly comment on it. I think what's happening in the Soviet Union is extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. It's one of the, it may turn out to be one of the really landmark events of the 20th century. General Secretary Gorbachev, now President Gorbachev, is a very impressive man. I've had the benefit of meeting him, talking with him at some length, and I find him extremely impressive. The question in the early days of the Gorbachev period were, is he serious? And I think you have to conclude, yes, he is an extremely serious man, and he's about a serious purpose. When you look at his public statements, it's interesting that he's talking about the serious problems of the world. He's not just talking about the normal kind of communist rhetoric that we've been used to for the last 50 years, but he's talking about real problems. He's talking about the economic problems, the environmental problems, the human problems that exist in the world. And you can say, well, he's not really sincere about that, but the evidence seems to be that he is sincere, that he does mean it. So I think something very important is happening, and he may not get everything done that he has tried to do. Russian history moves in kind of fits and starts. You have reformers, and then you have periods of passivity. Peter the Great was a great reformer. He didn't get everything done in his program, but he did make an impact on the country. Such an impact on the country that even to this very day, individual citizens bring one rosebud or one peony and put it on the grave of Peter the Great. So his achievements are very real in human terms as well as in political terms. Catherine the Great was a reformer who didn't get everything done but made an impact. Alexander I, Alexander II, Lenin. Khrushchev was a reformer. He didn't get very much done, but he made an impact. He tried. And Gorbachev is another in this succession of Russian leaders who have attempted to change Russia. And I think we have to take him seriously. Now, one of the incentives that he may have for his policies is his concern over nuclear weapons. And that's not certainly not an unreasonable motivation. If that is the case, I think we have to, from a foreign policy field, look very carefully at the coordination of conventional arms and nuclear arms, because if Gorbachev should succeed in totally negotiating out all nuclear arms, I think that's not too likely a possibility, but nonetheless we have to consider it. Then I think we would be left with a considerable disparity of conventional forces between the East and the West. So I think on our side we have to meet Gorbachev halfway, but to keep that balance in mind between conventional and nuclear forces. Now, you asked about the satellite countries. I don't think we can cover that whole range, but very briefly, the Baltic states are so interesting at the present time, and what will happen in the Baltic states. I think that the new Soviet regime has showed extraordinary restraint in allowing these national demonstrations to go forward in the Baltic states, to revive the local languages in Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. You can't imagine anything like this being tolerated in the Stalin period or even in the Brezhnev period. But the concern that you have to feel about this is that there must be some line that even Gorbachev can't cross. There must be some point where he has to say no. And if he does, the result is pretty well precast. You're Estonian, what, 900,000 Estonians, about a million or 1.5 million Latvians, about 2 million Lithuanians, as against 280 million population of the Soviet Union at large. So the result can't be in doubt, and that can be a very painful and dangerous and wrenching experience if what's happening now reaches the point that the Soviet Union says we've gone far enough and we can't go any further. So there are some dangers that I think we have to apprehend in what's going on, but a very fascinating and not without some hope for the future as we watch it all unfold.
Would you comment about the difficulties in the presidential-congressional relationship occasioned by the possibility of congressional leaks?
Well, in addressing that question, I would wish that it might be framed slightly differently. Instead of saying that congressional committees have a history of leaking, I would say that congressional committees have a reputation for leaking. And then I would say to you that I think it's a largely unearned reputation. My experience is that congressional committees have been pretty faithful in keeping the secrets of the government. I can only recall one serious leak. I served as a member of what was known as the Church Committee, the committee that investigated the intelligence community. And we did have one congressional leak as a result of that hearing. And that was the question that President Kennedy had a friend named Mrs. Exner. And that was just too much to keep. But I'm being serious. That was out of all the extraordinary things that the Church Committee learned about the intelligence community, that was the only thing that leaked. The big leakers in Washington are downtown. Because in order to give a push in one direction or another to some policy of the administration has some spokesman, sometimes the President himself, sometimes the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense, just instantly declassifies information. And things become public which had heretofore been top secret. So I don't think the Congress is as bad a leaker as its reputation sometimes portrays it. I think that the President should share his confidence with the Congress, and if anybody in the Congress violates that confidence, then I think that the Congress ought to come down on them very, very hard. Thank you very much.
To thank you is almost redundant, but for an edifying and thoroughly enjoyable evening, we do thank you very much indeed.